Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December 5th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. Today, we are going to be talking about governance and risk again. This is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the 64th consecutive edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meetings. That is a long road that we've walked down, and that is relevant because we're about to embark on a new chapter in what it is that we do here. And what we do here is complicated, and we're kind of we're figuring it out as we go along. And that's not an indictment, because what we're doing here is new-ish. We're determining what governance in the crypto space looks like. We're trying to figure out what decentralized finance actually means. We're trying to make sure that our stakeholders are engaged and informed and capable of making decisions and shaping monetary policy for a significant amount of the ecosystem. That's not a trivial task. In order for us to do that, we need to pick and choose what it is that we like from the real world and what we want from this brave new world that we've embarked upon. That's, as I said, that's a non-trivial task. We are living in, we have an ecosystem or a set of processes that effectively got us to where we are. And I'm actually enormously happy with how well we've all come together to build things and to support this protocol. It's been pretty inspiring, which is, I hope everybody was sitting down, because I'm not usually that optimistic and or complimentary, but there you go. It's recorded for posterity. We've launched MCD though, and MCD is actually getting ramped up in complexity this week. And we're gonna, as far as governance is concerned, and we're gonna see some evidence of that as we review the 4 polls, I can't remember anymore, that are in the existing system, and dealing with the executive that is going to arrive tomorrow. That's a roll-up of all those things. And so we need to understand what it is we do, what it is we did, and what things are going to look like in the future. And that's not going to be something, it's my opinion that we can't allow that to develop organically. We need to be a little more targeted than we have in the past, because we're not dealing with a single peg and a single lever. So it's not a size stability fee that we're here to deal with. We're here to, is somebody having a bubble bath? What is that noise? We're here to deal with MCD, and we have a significant number of levers that we need to manage, as well as the size stability fee. And how we coordinate and work together and deal with all of these new issues is going to be the topic of conversation that I'm not going to let go until we come up with something more sophisticated. And so here's what I would like to see. I've talked about this in the last 3 or 4 calls. At the end of each one of these talks, I've promised that I would post a forum thread that outlined the loose parameters of this this new working group that I've been discussing, and I've let the team down every single time. But last night I spent 2 or 3 hours. I'm on page number 6 of this forum post. I'm going to polish it up and get it posted right after the call. Or actually, let's be realistic. Hopefully by the end of the day, probably by Monday. But I want to take this opportunity to go over some of the things that I've been thinking and see if I can spark some conversations, because in this call, we don't make decisions about the future of the protocol, but we do debate issues and set precedents and establish norms and all the rest. And we have access to some of the most engaged stakeholders here, so I would dearly love to hear some feedback from the group as we go along. So if you hear something that sounds interesting to you, make a note, or just straight up interrupt me, and we can go off script. I don't mind. Here's the idea that I've been formulating. What we're doing here is we're building an open source governance ecosystem, and that is not a buzzword. That's actually what it is. In all the ways that I can anticipate, what we're doing here is an open source project. The tooling, the mechanisms, the remote teams, the processes, and the project plans, all the rest of it fits into models that I'm sure that many of us, if not potentially all of us in this call are familiar with. We've all had to deal with projects or whatever it is we do for day jobs, if your day job isn't also a MakerDAO. And to ignore those existing paradigms would be silly, I think. And so what I would like to do is have a proposal go into the forums, and I'm going to take the first kick at that can, about how we can look back at what governance is that got us to where we're at and what we think governance should be in the coming year to get us where we need to be. We've dealt with a significant number of challenges. I think some of them are top of mind, some of them have fallen to the wayside. We need to audit all of these ideas and plans and schemes, get them together into a project plan, start scoping out some of those ideas, figuring out a priority list, assigning tasks to people, coming up with appropriate incentivizations and mechanisms to ensure that that work is rewarded fairly, and then begin to improve. This begin to improve part is the part that I'm most excited about, because we have MakerDAO and we have the Maker Foundation, and the MakerDAO, which is at this point sort of a euphemism for everything that's not the Maker Foundation. And that's something else we're going to be clarifying, or the community the royal we will be clarifying in the coming months. This is an opportunity for the community and the foundation to build a very robust bridge between these two great peoples of ours. I would like for the governance version 2 ecosystem to work directly with the foundation and provide the foundation with requirements and plans and processes, and then we can work together to make sure that everybody's needs are being met. So I'm going to, okay, so maybe I'm going to jump around a bit. So that's the idea. So we need to collect these issues, we need to categorize them, figure out what the priorities are, start brainstorming these solutions with people that have been engaged and or experienced pain points with the ecosystem or the governance ecosystem so far. Then we form a working group once we've identified people that are interested in helping us out in doing the work. And then we start splitting off and start doing things and coming up with calendars and schedules and all those other wonderful things, and then start thinking about what tooling do we need. Like, do we track this stuff in a GitHub project? Do we do Trello or some other abomination of project management tools that are out there? Obviously, I'm not a fan, but we need to figure out how to track this stuff and make sure that we're all coordinated and set some timelines and treat this as a real project. And I think that if we can find the minimum level of viable process we can attach to this thing, we're going to see some significant movement. And I'm super excited about that. And for actually, I'm going to jump through to a section farther down my text file, because I think I'm going to, otherwise I'd be talking too much today. But here's where things are going to become slightly a bit of a downer right before I hand it off to Cyrus. I want to talk about some of the challenges that we've or at least the list that I came up with as I've just been running through this doc of things that we could think about and do some exploration to figure out whether these things are problems or they're not problems and we're fine with them, and if they are problems, what we can do to fix them. And here's my list of grievances and complaints about the system that I've been critically responsible for creating. There we go. So we have a situation around polling and voting cadence. We thought we have a system right now where we vote every week in order to manage the stability fees. And that is an example of something that I like to refer to as being a new normal. We didn't always do that. And we started to do that because we had substantial peg deviation the early part of last year, and it required hands-on management in order to bring down that stability fee that was far too high and stabilize the peg. We stabilized the peg, at least in my opinion. People would object, but 50 bips feels pretty stable to me. But yet we still vote every week, and that's an example of a new normal. We vote every week. Why? Because we vote every week. And why do we vote every week? Who knows? We can't remember. So we need to start examining some of these new normals, some of these norms that we've internalized to make sure that we're not grandfathering things into this new world that we don't quite need anymore. So let's take a look at polling and voting cadence. Let's take a look at the rate stepping. Does rate stepping work for everything? Exponential rate stepping seems to be a fairly effective plan when it comes to stability fees, but does that make sense for the other levers that we're going to have available to us soon? Let's get a targeted discussion happening around delegation. People are interested in it. That topic comes up again and again, but it's not going to get any traction unless we formalize that activity and we get a group of stakeholders to own this thing and figuring out who in the community can build this thing for us. I already touched on communication a bit. We do a lot in this space with the Maker protocol. There's tons of activity. That represents a barrier to entry. There's cognitive overhead involved with getting new people involved in the system. So if you're not a fanatic, it's hard to break in. We need to figure out how do we reduce the friction to onboard new voters and make them feel comfortable with understanding what it is they're voting on. We have issues with executives. We have frequently had weak executives or contentious executives. We need to understand why that is and whether there's a way we can route around that, or whether we need to examine some larger issues like continuous approval voting in general. Right now we have a single executive represents a picture of the system, and then we have a contender picture of the system that we vote on every week. I'm not sure that gives us enough flexibility. We're going to run into a situation where we have mutually exclusive polls that are wrapped up together, or we're going to run into a situation where one of those polls is contradictory or extremely contentious, and then we're going to have troubles. I'm wary of making predictions, but we're going to run into a situation where we're not going to be able to ratify an executive because there's something in that executive that people don't like. We need to decide whether, if that is a problem, do we need multiple executives? And if so, what does that look like? It's going to be a tricky one. We also have, with the continuous approval voting system, we have something called hats. And we have a bunch of other really fun nomenclature. But the TLDR on that is that frequently significant amounts of Maker are being staked on on executives that we have very little visibility into. We can't actually see them because of the way the UI works. We need to have external tooling and scripts to figure out where that Maker is. We don't have insight into why that Maker is where it is. Do people move their Maker to old expired executives because they've forgotten that it's there? Or is this an act of silent protest because people are disinterested in the two current ones? Or is this an activity that serves to secure the existing state of the system? So these people are reluctant or trying to de-risk activities. So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. So we have this hat situation that needs to be understood. We have a significant number of levers that are happening. So we saw that this week where we have a size stability fee, a die stability fee. We have a debt ceiling raise and lower on two different protocols. That's a lot of information that needs to be digested, and understanding how all of those things interact with each other is enormously complicated. So how do we manage that that picture, I guess? Like how do we ensure that the people that are voting on these things have an opportunity to research and understand the relationship all of these numbers have with each other? It occurs to me that my list of grievances is far longer than I thought. So let me just talk about the names of the headings, and then we can move on. So apathy is a problem. Incentivization is a problem. Scheduling and calendaring is a problem. So who gets to decide when we do what? If we have to do a vote, or some people think we should do a vote outside the cadence, who gets to decide when that is and who does the work? That's a question that still needs to be answered. Which voting system do we prefer? There's been some great discussions recently about plurality voting or first past the post. We have ranked choice. We have instant runoff. There's other things we can begin thinking about. There's actually this last DSR vote. It was an interesting thing to watch because we saw two camps form, and then we saw capitulation right before the vote expired, and that was an interesting behavior to see in real time. So we need to decide whether was that an example of the system working, or does that mean that we do need a ranked choice or a more liquid version of this system than we already have. We have to answer some really exhausting questions once and for all. And I'm probably going to hear the audible groans here, but I'm still not sure we understand what consensus actually means and how we measure consensus and whether we know that we've actually achieved it yet. So that's something that we need to get a very clear understanding in this group. One of the major things I would like for that working group to come away with, and have the risk teams and maybe some ecosystem actors help out, is to begin to acquire empirical evidence that tells us whether the things that we thought were true actually are true. Because this is scientific governance. The assumption here is that we are making decisions based on evidence that we all share, and that we have an ability to look back in time and do some back tests and or make some loose predictions based on past activity. I'm not sure that we've reached that level of sophistication, but we should be there. So if we are deciding that we're going to change the cadence, or we're going to change the stepping, or we're going to change X, Y, and Z, it's time that as a group we start putting some data behind that. And I think one of the great first steps for that process would be looking back at our weekly stability fee polls for the last year, collecting what our activity was, and collecting data on how the market responded to those things, and make sure that some of our assumptions are actually true. Because spoiler alert, I don't think they are. I think that there's a certain number of the votes that we had last year, I'm reasonably sure did nothing. But I would love to be proved wrong, so it's time that we should collect some data to figure out whether these votes actually we are giving them enough time to take effect. Well, actually, let's not get into it, but let's start gathering data to prove that we're right when we say that we're going to do something for a reason. And so actually, let me tie it back up a bit, because this is going longer than I expected. So once we have this working group, once we have processes in place, once we've figured out which of my personal list of improvements, and we gather the community's list of improvements, which ones of those we think are most important, and who has some ideas and the inclination to help us fix them, let's form some working groups. Let's talk about how funding that activity is going to look, and then eventually get some processes in place and create some canonical documentation, and set up some meetings with the foundation proper and some of our internal stakeholders to make sure that these things get addressed. Maybe I will leave it there. So I did toss out a whole pile of random thoughts and ideas, and I will formalize those into a forum post. Were there any questions in the sidebar that I need to respond to? I don't think so. All right, no questions I need to respond to. All right, so I think I'm going to leave it there. So do some soul searching, people in this call, and or people that might be watching the YouTubes in the distant future. Whether you have the inclination or some ideas about how to improve the system and improve governance, and join us in the forums, and we can try to do this next glorious experiment in self-organization and community-led open source governance, which I think is one of the most interesting things we're doing at MakerDAO. So anyways, I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to hand it off to you, LongForWisdom, if you want to give us a recap of what's been happening in the forums this week.
Yeah, absolutely. 1 second. Cool. Right. So I've had a couple of new threads pop up, and some continuing discussion in some of the older ones. So one of the new ones that I was pretty excited to see, which Rich mentioned as well, was Hexanaut suggested switching to ranked choice voting for the multiple choice governance votes, which personally I think is a good idea, and I'm hoping we can get some more people discuss and sort of add in their thoughts to that. In addition to that, we've seen sort of continued debates on a couple of the threads from last week regarding financial incentive to get participation in governance voting, and talking about the DSR and SF spreads. I know, like, a lot of that. There's been a lot of sort of chat in the Rocket chat as well about the sort of DSR SF spreads and things as well. So we'll sort of see that sort of thing happening. I think that's kind of it. There's no real consensus seeking going on at the moment, I don't think. Just more discussion. Not a huge amount to report.
All right, cool. Thanks for that, L Dubs. Yeah, I don't know. It's still not sticking. There's got to be a nickname for you. I'm not saying LongForWisdom for much longer. Cyrus, do you want to tell us a bit about migration?
Sure. One second. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the migration status so far. Earlier this week, we had a whole bunch of exchanges all migrate at once. I think it was on Monday. I think a week ago, the total DAI supply was, I think, only about 22 million, and now it's up to 50 million. Quick reminder that there is now a global debt ceiling and collateral specific debt ceilings. So the ETH debt ceiling is 50 million, and we're almost there, but it's not the same as the total one. There was a governance poll that concluded today that is, if passed, or if the executive vote passes, the ETH debt ceiling will be raised by 25 million. The DAI and the migration contract I'll come back to in a bit. That's obviously important. The DSR utilization rate has dropped back down to 8%. I think it had climbed up to almost 20%, but looks like, I mean, kind of expected, but all the exchanges and just DAI platforms have not been depositing their users' DAI into the DSR. Sure, there's plenty of good reasons for that. Just more technical work, potential compliance reasons, and so forth. But I think the community, I think we should all try to find a way to find out why more people aren't using the DSR. In fact, ironically, there's this meme out there that maker holders, why would they raise the DSR if it costs them more money? But in fact, we're actually trying to get people to use it. So yeah, I think this is going to probably become an increasingly important thing to keep an eye on, the DSR utilization. The size supply has fallen, obviously, because of the exchange migrations as well. It's down to 60 million. There's obviously now a whole bunch of debt ceiling room here, and that same governance poll that was, I think, passed today. If it passes an executive, it would reduce this by 25 million down to 95 million. As we talked about in the migration risk construct a few weeks ago, it's probably wise to keep some buffer there to allow for market makers if they need to spin up some liquidity. And here we can kind of see the DAI supply between Psi and DAI, pretty much neck and neck, right? 60 and 50. To be honest, this is probably not a great position to be in at this moment, especially now that all the big liquidity providers have switched over. I'm not sure if there's too much more in the pipeline. And there's a couple that I can identify that I'll also get to in a bit. But, you know, this kind of even 50-50 split is, I mean, it's just going to be a little bit more difficult to manage. So we're going to have to talk about this as well. And in particular, one of the things kind of relating to this is the DAI from the migration contract. So right now it's sitting at 78,000. But just generally speaking, over the past few weeks, this has been basically zero the entire time. And even on Monday, I think we saw something like a quick 10 million influx of Psi into the migration contract, and it was all drained within an hour. This liquidity is generally scooped up very, very quickly, which is interesting for a number of reasons. But in general, it certainly makes CDP migration much harder, and it makes the Psi supply stay higher than we'd like. One thing we were noticing was that, so there's two ways to drain Psi from the migration contract. One is through a standard migration from the CDP owner, but then you can also mint DAI yourself and then use the migration contract in reverse and drain the Psi liquidity using fresh DAI, which is put there for somewhat of an arbitrage purpose for price stability if needed, but it also potentially opened up the door for some sort of hoarding attack. So we looked into this a bit, and we basically, these are the addresses that used the swap DAI to Psi function. So these are not typical CDP migrations. These are just individual actors draining the Psi liquidity from the migration contract. And these colored groups are the same actor. I mean, the groups are each one different actor. Anyways, what we found out was that the top people draining the Psi liquidity were actually using that Psi to just pay off existing CDPs, which is actually really great news. Means that they're not just hoarding the Psi. The reason they were doing this is because the migration function requires kind of you to migrate your entire CDP at once, which makes it difficult for the large ones. So they were basically using spare capital to basically migrate in chunks. So this is really good news from a perspective of were people draining the migration contract for some sort of hoarding attack. Some of these are interesting, the ones that have like super low success rates. Potentially those may be bot activity that are just trying to take as much as they can, but the amount of Psi that they're taking diminishes pretty rapidly. What's important is that just the top few are definitely just paying off existing CDPs. Any questions so far?
Do you have any stats about the migration tools like DeFi Saver or InstaDApp? How that's affected it?
We do have some InstaDApp data here, but I'm not sure if this has been fully, I can't really vet to the complete accuracy of this. But yeah, this is the InstaDApp data we've collected so far. Have not looked into DeFi Saver yet. But we can. There's a lot of good chain analysis to do surrounding this. Well, anyways, hoarding attack aside, which is great that that's not happening yet, we are still seeing a whole bunch of customer support issues with migration. There's a forum thread here that people maybe want to participate in, talking about your migration experience. But I think the fact that we've even reached this point, it really says a lot about the liquidity situation. And as a community, we're at a point where we can't really tell people anymore that, oh, there's just more liquidity coming any day now, and be patient. But instead, I think the correct response is be patient, because governance should be working on a solution to provide liquidity for CDP owners who have not migrated in. That's kind of a philosophical question of if indeed it is the community's job to, like, is it the role of governance to make sure that there is liquidity in the migration contract? I would say yes. I don't know if that's entirely clear cut, but
to be clear, I mean, so we're all on the same page. I mean, when you talk about the liquidity, it's part of the gate, right? But you don't have to use the migration contract. You can cause and pay down Psi directly, unlock your ETH, and then mint DAI, sell your DAI, and cycle it back around.
yeah, but
And there is it's not the same price. I mean, it is more expensive to do it that way for certain.
It's
but
not
it's
even
possible.
price though. It's not even just having to pay a premium on Psi. It's the availability of a separate spare pool of capital that they can use to acquire the Psi, right? The migration contract allows CDP owners to migrate without needing any additional capital, which is
that's 100% agreed, but that makes the assumption that the CDP holders have 100% of their assets and liquidity 100% tied up. I mean, in someone who's 100% tied up in a CDP, yeah, then the migration contract is your only option.
Yeah, I wouldn't put that past crypto speculators to not have 100% of their assets in a. Anyways, I agree, but and I'm not saying one way or another. I think it's an open question. If governance wants to provide as easy a migration as possible, add that to the soul searching list of questions.
I mean, what are the options here, other than like global settlement? How do you just spin up Psi liquidity? If
I'm just about to get to that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Just really quickly, I'm not going to talk too much about price and volume and all that, so I'll leave that to Vishesh. But quick point I want to make is that Psi has been dropping below $1 for the first time in months, which has been interesting because it was above $1 for like a solid 3-4 months. That being said, just because, and what I wanted to highlight is that just because it's below $1, it's important to realize that the risk is still asymmetrically in the upside. We're still at the same risk of having a huge blow to the upside in case there is some sort of a panic due to migration. So let's not get too comfortable or complacent with the Psi price just because it's below $1. There's still significant upside risk, which is negative, which would be bad. Okay, so this is just a proposed. These are really just some thoughts, really. If governance doesn't inject liquidity, which they're free to do so, we might lose a chunk of our user base, right? So right now there's 60 million Psi left over. If hypothetically, if emergency shutdown were to be called today, I would be surprised if more than a quarter of that user base came back into MCD, right? Just kind of not a fun thing to go through for the users. And so we have to maybe think about how we can get them to come over and what it would take to do so. So first step would be is how much of that Psi is even active? Can we do some chain analysis, look at the Psi holders, look at their distribution of holdings, look at the CDP owners, track to see if these accounts are even still around. For example, like the Coinbase Earn campaign, you know, you have like tens of thousands of CDPs with $1 in them. I mean, we should probably tally that up, see what that's like. We need to, or we could also potentially plan monetary policy in advance. Last week, Primoz gave a really good presentation on the relationship between the different risk parameters, the two stability fees and the DSR. We could hopefully start thinking about how to use these in a more intended manner with some rationale behind it. So for example, if we wanted to supply liquidity to the migration contract, we could lower the SCD stability fee and just keep increasing the DSR. Well, the DSR was voted to go up today to 4%, but that would potentially incentivize market makers to spin up liquidity and put in the migration contract. Of course, that comes at a cost to the maker protocol, so need to do some calculations there. Yeah, in general, this is a fair amount of work. There are probably various different ways to go about this. I've been talking about in the chats over the past couple of weeks. Community has to somehow align on its goals, what it's even trying to achieve, what it's trying to target, and then apply a governance strategy that moves towards those goals. So if we don't want to target the remaining 60 million Psi users, then we should probably have a different monetary policy plan. If we do, then we need to start thinking about the incentives behind the DSR and the SCD stability fee and see how we might use this to our benefit. And, you know, additionally, that involves a lot of public comms. If we're trying to get CDP owners to migrate using the migration contract, we certainly don't want them to pay premiums on the open marketplace. We would just need to kind of convey to them that there is liquidity coming, and this is potentially the role of governance and the community to make all this stuff happen. But I think these are certainly more philosophical questions than hard defined plans that the community should do. Potentially this call, the forums, the chats are all kind of some sort of consensus signal gathering platform where we can try to align on what it is we want to do here, and then start putting in the work towards achieving it. One more thing I forgot to mention, just kind of a minor thing in terms of looking at the remaining side distribution. So there's 60 million. There is about 13 million sitting in compound. So presumably that's kind of like a mobile Psi pool. And then of the remaining 47 million, you know, maybe another 5 to 10 million in various secondary lending and DEX platforms. And then maybe there's about 40 million just free floating Psi. Maybe we can look at the market maker inventories, see what's there, and then kind of try to work our way backwards into finding out what's being held in the hands of end users from there. That's it for me. Certainly a lot to talk about here. I wonder if maybe we should do Vishesh's segment first, because I think the volume and the price progression over the past few weeks is also something important that plays into all this, and maybe we can discuss after.
Cyrus, one quick question.
Sure.
Are you able to share that spreadsheet with the people who've been interacting with the migration contract?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely.
Cool.
I should mention, because I probably won't be around after, but there is, and I shudder to mention this, but we could, in theory, put up another migration contract that gives governance the ability to switch off the DAI to Psi one-to-one conversion back over if we're really worried about people hoarding single collateral DAI.
Yeah, that was something I forgot to mention as well, because that discussion had been popping up around as well, about turning that off. I think that's certainly possible. I think that's just because that has to be like likely has to be another governance-driven decision. I think we're at a premium for trying to get governance to decide on things. So I'm hoping to just try to use our limited bandwidth to make kind of the highest level decisions in my mind, rather than trying to micromanage different aspects of the technicals of the protocol. I think maybe hopefully we can leave that to something to discuss if that attack is starting to happen. I don't know. Yeah, certainly I forgot to bring it up about redeploying the migration contract with the DAI to Psi function removed.
Yeah, I mean, like the argument against that is just like, as you showed in that the spreadsheet, like a lot of these people who had very large CDPs, like this was probably the only way that they could get that amount of size Psi without a ridiculous spread.
Right. Let me just run through some questions in the chat. Are there any questions in the chat there's a lot of conversation to go through?
Yeah, there was a fairly active side chat.
Yeah.
Anybody who is involved with that, like, please feel free just to jump on the mic and get everybody involved. Matthew, you mentioned something about emergency shutdown, which was interesting. Makerman, you had a pile of things to contribute. If you have any of those questions you want to ask Cyrus directly, please do. Xenophon has a question. Are there any compelling arguments against increasing the stability fee for Psi only?
Yeah, in my mind, there's a fair number of compelling arguments to not increase the Psi stability fee, because that would reduce liquidity for Psi, and it would push it. Right. Okay, so yeah, I get this question a lot. To increase the stability fee to shake out the CDP owners and force them to close out. I'm going to just kind of keep repeating the same answer, is that there are many different ways to force this migration to happen. On the extreme end is to just call emergency shutdown today. And different options have various degrees of twisting the knife on the users. So if that's, if MakerDAO is some ruthless organization, then sure, there's ways to make this happen. At the very least, at least on my end, I could propose ideas that are from kind of the least disruptive down to the most disruptive. And increasing the stability fee is certainly one of the more disruptive methods for forcing this migration.
Cyrus, what's like the current state of just making an artificially low stability fee so that there's less liquidity issues, and then in part like doing the whole really tight spread on the MCD side so that we can raise the DSR a bit? That way it would give market makers, right, the incentive to mint Psi, put it in the migration contract, and then just with the DAI that they receive, they can earn that 4%, which would be a profit on top of the stability fee, which would be artificially low on the single collateral DAI side.
Yeah, that's the prevailing theory or plan in terms of what maybe makes the most sense. The latest is that think we're kind of looking for some discussion, some consensus seeking on kind of what the direction is we want to go in before we, because there's a lot of work that would have to go into a plan like that, a lot of research and analysis. And I don't want to just come out and say, this is what monetary policy needs to look like for the next 3 months, hoping that we can build some sort of organic discussion around this, and maybe through the forums try to figure out if this is a direction we want to go in. And if so, then the risk team can start putting in the work necessary to gather the data, crunch some numbers, and start proposing some strategies. And it would probably be another big risk construct that kind of cover the risks, the edge cases, what could go wrong, contingency plans, and so on.
Hey guys, if you look at, sorry to interrupt, if you look at the top holders on just die hold, look on Etherscan, like I'm one of them. We're about to move all that over, so that's probably be on the 1.5 million. But you know, you still have Nexio, Compound, Nuo Network, Spank Chains, Multisig, and you have I think the biggest thing you have to look at, besides moving over the lenders, is moving over a whole bunch of people that have 100,000 inside just sitting there. Just looks like there's pages and pages and pages of people like $50,000 to $100,000. That's where I think it's gonna be difficult to move them over. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's good to keep in mind is that no matter what, eventually something will have to be done. So maybe this 60 million just naturally on its own trickles down to 40 million psi left over. Then we're just basically in the same spot. And I don't think there's anything wrong with planning in ahead for a situation where we might need to start playing with monetary policy levers. You see, yeah, certainly there's still more migration coming. This is, I guess, maybe just a preemptive plan to start discussions on what we could do.
Completely agree.
It's also just a plan to protect the end user, right, from like having the psi, you know, or whatever left over. Whoever gets stuck with the psi and a CDP just ends up having like a very unfavorable situation for themselves.
I also think there's an important aspect to remember that while we want to protect the psi users, you don't want to compromise the entire system as a whole for one users that are sitting on a legacy platform that have migration tools in front of them. If we put forth a migration plan, I don't care, a year from now, and folks still haven't migrated, the two systems, because of that migration bridge, are connected. That risk on one system directly impacts the other. You know, at some point you got to let it go. And the question is, how well do we communicate it and what tools do we use?
Yeah, I think that's the importance of just highlighting the fact that this thing will be, you know, globally settled, emergency shutdown, whatever you want to call it, because at the end, if maker governance doesn't want to, you know, continue governing both protocols, like I think it's very clear that our intention is to deprecate the system after a certain point because it's shrinking. But unless we start seeing organic growth, like the people that are sitting on the legacy system are kind of going to get stuck with a claim on ETH once emergency shutdown happens. So it's
Right. So
it would make sense to pay like market makers in a sense through monetary policy levers to provide that exit for those end users.
Yeah, in my opinion, if it was up to me, I think because no matter what, there's going to be some balance of psi that needs to be shut down. I think as long as the community were to make like a good faith effort in saying, hey, like we did everything in our power to get as many people over as possible, and we gave like a good window of time, and we even sweetened the deal a little bit to try to really get it to happen. I think at that point, the community can safely do what they need to do and basically, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
At this point, do you guys have any indication on like the time frame, or is it still in discussions? Or?
It's no. I mean, there's no discussion. It's not up to anyone but the community per se. I think before even thinking about emergency shutdown, what really needs to be discussed is just what's the overall plan, and then how do you tie in emergency shutdown into what the plan is, because it's entirely dependent on what our goals are and what we're trying to achieve. And that's not something that's historically been easy for decentralized governance. And Rich talked about this a bit in his segment, but up until now, Maker hasn't really had to make any significant active decisions. The monetary policy has been fairly deterministic in response to the Psi price. Now we're at a stage where governance, it's not like an option, but it's a requirement for them to be more active. Simple example is that now with the DSR, different DSR and stability fee pairs can achieve DAI stability. There isn't one unique combination of DSR and stability fee that will keep DAI stable. So big question is, what are the differences between the different pairs, and what are the incentives that result, and what are the incentives that we want to target? This is probably going to be a challenge for governance, but no better time to work on it, I guess.
Maybe like a good framing of the question is, how small does the single collateral DAI system have to wind down to before we should start seriously considering the well-being of the end users and kind of gracefully getting them out of there?
Yeah, that would
Or
be
what percentage of Psi is comparative to the aggregate of Psi and DAI. And the other part of this becomes, at some point when you start growing the DAI ecosystem and adding other collateral in, it just turns into a rounding error, and we may never be the risk right now today when the Psi, in comparative what you said at the beginning, Cyrus, where whatever the number is, 60 million, 40 million, right? There's a risk right now because we're managing two systems. You fast forward it, doesn't matter, a year, and if DAI is, pick some crazy number, 10 billion, and Psi is sitting at 30 million, it really isn't a risk. Right now it is.
And here's the problem with the governance overhead. Can anyone even name me 3 exchanges that Psi is still trading on? Right, we have Psi that's basically floating out there with no good sources of liquidity, but there's 60 million of it out there. That poses somewhat of a threat to both the CDP owners and the Psi holders. Of course, there's Uniswap, but
so doesn't that boil down to who provides liquidity on the DEXs, because they're naturally going to be the last ones trading Psi? So in the end, it does fall to like the market makers or who are the leftover market makers for Psi, right?
Yeah, but the market makers are profit seeking, right? And this ties in heavily with the emergency shutdown. If market makers can make more money keeping DAI unstable by exploiting the illiquidity and the lack of exchanges, then they'll do that. However, if there is a target deadline that's been somewhat confirmed or credible by the community, then they'll put all their market making efforts towards keeping DAI stable for the eventual emergency shutdown.
Right.
Maybe we need to define the options that are open to us, or try and get sort of write-ups or clear summaries of what the options are, and then we can figure out what we want to do.
Yeah, it sounds like either the market makers profit off of the people left over who are trying to get some Psi liquidity, or maker governance subsidizes that cost by creating some favorable monetary policy configuration.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, David.
And so where's the latest conversation on this happening? Is it in the DSR stability fee tight spread forum post, or where's a good place to
Yeah, that one's certainly good. Maybe we should probably spin up a separate migration discussion forum thread, or just the governance and risk channel on Rocket Chat. Those are the two main forums I've seen.
Yeah, the governance and risk channel on Rocket Chat, by the way, is very active. It's definitely fresh conversation, some of which is not happening in the forums, which is just an interesting topic overall to consider.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I do believe it's valuable that we all at some point have an absolute window where Psy gets the emergency shutdown. And it doesn't matter if it's 6 months or 3 years, just something that is well communicated, that is date X and it is certain. And being able to communicate that. Because what I'm concerned we're also going to find out is that Psy to DAI migration contract right now is 120,000. And 3 days ago, when we had a huge move, it looked like we were going to hit that ETH ceiling immediately, and we haven't yet. And the question becomes, what happens when we expand that ETH ceiling to whatever, theoretically, if the executive vote passes and it becomes 75 million? What if we just sit where we're at right now inside? No additional other folks sit there and migrate. It's not really a risk then. It's not really moving. But at the exact same time, it's hanging out there. We just have to have a window. I think it's important to introduce certainty when it gets shut down. I think that's one of the most fundamental polls we should put up.
Yeah, but how do we even go about, like, what's the heuristic for even figuring out when that should be? It's not entirely clear.
Any other major system upgrade for software? Start off with 3 years, and we can always back it into something that's earlier if we need to. Or if the peg on Psy breaks too much in either direction, too high or too low, then have it be some type of a triggered event. I mean, if it hits 1.10 or 90 cents, then we should probably shut it down. And if it's going to sit out there in La La Land at 102 and doesn't hurt anybody, then let it sit out there.
I think you just gave Rich a heart attack with the 3 years timeline.
Well, I got get hell from some folks for saying 3 months, and so fine, I'll just make it 3 years, right? So
I think the key is, like, the date is obviously up for discussion, but the key here, though, is creating a very clear sense of expectation and figuring out how that expectation can be truly believed, right? Emergency shutdown has always been one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal, but it's not a thing until it actually happens. And ensuring that it does happen and having the community coordinate and come up with a date that is not subject to change would be critical. So that's the part that I find most interesting. How does that happen? Are the questions tailing off a bit? Cyrus, should we dig into state of the pegs and then maybe circle back to this?
Yeah, because I think these questions are going to keep going.
Yeah, I'm expecting it. Like, we're going to spend weeks and weeks talking about this. So there's no rush. Vishesh, all queued up?
Battery died.
Yeah, I think we
No.
got too close.
Right.
100%.
Okay. Cyrus covered. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, we could hear you.
Okay. So Cyrus covered a lot this week, but we'll just touch on some of the things I didn't. So, in particular, on the second was when we saw, roughly 17, 18 million Psy being wiped away. And similarly, we saw in that same time frame large quantities of DAI being moved over. So I'm not going to duplicate the migration stuff, but yeah, roughly 48 million DAI from ETH and 1.5 from BAT. Stability fee still sitting at 4%. So I think one of the things to touch on here is just like how we start to think about this stability fee versus what is currently still available on secondary lending platforms. So 4 million locked up in the DSR at a 2% savings rate. I think that's pretty decent for what the savings rate is there. If we were expecting this to be more heavily used, I think this rate would most likely need to be a bit higher. As far as some of the trading activity, so just to look at the summary view, DAI has been pretty decent trading volume, 1.5 million in the last 24 hours. You would expect a little bit more with some of the activity that's been going on with migration. Now that we roughly have 50 million DAI, you would think that this number would be a little bit higher. The price, as was noted by Rich, has been sitting a bit below $1 for both assets currently. So that's just something to watch. I mean, it's still pretty darn close, but very, very slightly below. And then obviously trading volume for Psy has just dropped off because it's really no longer being supported. In the last 7 days, the DAI trading volume at roughly 6.5, 7 million. Again, mid to low for a 7-day time frame, but trading again just slightly below $1. So this will be something to watch because there's been a lot of discussion around what kind of relative price differential you want to see between DAI and Psy in order to make sure that migration is happening smoothly and people are incentivized to be using DAI. And I think rates differential is one conversation and price differential is a different conversation. So I think it'll just be good to manage those two threads separately. As far as secondary lending, so for Psy, that DYDX is dropped to 0, which is good. That's switched over. For Compound, we have the Psy borrow rate sitting at roughly 2.5%, with a supply rate of much higher, around 8%. So that's potentially interesting to watch. It's theoretically still lucrative to lend out Psy, but the volumes have dropped pretty significantly. So that's good news, and that's honestly what creates those rate differentials. So that borrow volume is dropped to roughly 6 million, and then the supply about 18 million. It was 19. It's in the last few hours come down to about 18. And it's not much point in talking about the utilization rates of those anymore. But yeah, that's comparatively very low utilization. So that's theoretically a good sign for migration. As far as MCD, so you can see here the total amount being supplied, like I said, around 18 million, and the amount borrowed somewhere between 5 and 6 million. For MCD, the total amount being supplied roughly 7 million, and about 6 of that being borrowed. So this, MCD is very high utilization on Compound right now, but a much smaller volume being lent out, even though the total supply of DAI and Psy is pretty similar at the moment. So yeah, you can see here that high utilization with the updated sort of interest rate formula is actually led to very low cost for borrowing MCD on Compound right now, but also very low yield for supplying. So the interesting thing here is the cost for borrowing on Compound slightly below the stability fee, but a lot of folks, at least in the last few days, have preferred to go straight to Maker to borrow that DAI, primarily because those were folks that were simply just migrating from Psy to DAI in the first place. But also, I think there's been some buzz and I think a general consensus that rate differential is not significant enough to incentivize people to use Compound's contracts over Maker to like any significant volume. And so it'll be interesting to watch like this borrow rate, the differential between that and the stability fee, how much it incentivizes people to use compound versus maker. Now, there's something to be said about the people that use compound, prior for SCD borrowing, looking for different sort of risk parameters. And as more risk parameters become available in MCD, whether that actually just kind of neutralizes this balance or not, or if people still just do tend to prefer using compound. So for now, it makes sense why there's 6 or 7 million on compound, being borrowed on compound. But in the future, as more risk parameters become available, it will be interesting to watch if that sort of relative ratio of the percentage of total DAI that's being lent and borrowed on secondary lending versus directly on maker will hold the way it did in SCD. Okay, so yeah, not a lot of new stuff this week, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer. I don't think there are.
No, I don't see anything in the chat.
Markets were slow this week. Except for actually the MKR market was extremely active last night. I don't know if anybody was following.
Yeah, I saw that. This is where the jazz music would come in, just FYI.
Well, we know how Rich loves awkward silences, so.
I know.
Yeah, I'm just about to crack, actually. I'm desperately searching through the sidebar to see if there's anything that needs to be addressed. So obviously, there's all kinds of things to talk about, but we don't necessarily always have to do it in these Q&A sessions at the end. There are things to consider, though. Governance version 2, the re-governing, I don't know, let's come up with a catchy title that needs to be addressed. We have migration in progress that can be tweaked, some significant questions that need to be answered there. And we also have a significant number of polls that just went through the portal. So if anybody has questions or comments about any of those topics, we could dig into that for a bit. And then we can give it
Actually,
a few
Rich,
minutes. Sure.
Today, if I can Q instead of A, I'm kind of curious actually. So we had a few discussions early on with SCD. I mean, like, frankly, I'm spending a lot of time working on figuring out like retooling for MCD, but we had a lot of conversations early on in call it the second SCD, where we discussed like, okay, what is scientific governance? What are the types of questions that we're trying to answer? Which was really informative for us sort of figuring out what kind of tooling we wanted to look at and like what types of analysis we think are meaningful versus not. So it would be interesting to like have a little bit of a refresh of that and see if there are like particular questions that folks are considering around MCD and perhaps even around migration that would inform the kinds of things that we should be talking about in these governance meetings. That's just kind of like for the floor.
Yeah, I like that line of questioning, actually. And this is something that we've been talking about off and on. Maybe this is another one of those interesting discussions that we had early on, but fell by the wayside. And as we got accustomed to the new normal, we stopped asking those questions. But tooling and analytics at the outset were going to be critical components of how we made our decisions. And the idea was that we would have open data sets and we'd have dashboards and we would have analytics mechanisms of workflows that people would be able to share and confirm for themselves or run their own queries and then share those with the rest of the group. And that's something that we haven't talked about in these calls, I don't think, but we've been discussing internally. And I think that possibly we need some of those mechanisms to be in place before we can start doing things like that back testing I was talking about, to figure out which of our decisions that we've made had an effect, and trying to figure out what that effect is and what kind of lags we're dealing with between raising or lowering a number and watching the ecosystem respond to that, outside of all the potentially uncountable confounding variables that might have an effect there. It's an interesting discussion. I'm not sure what the best way forward is. There's ecosystem actors that have tooling that we could leverage. Obviously, like there's teams like Sentiment, Dune Analytics, and Splunk even. The list goes on and on. Some of my concerns, though, is I want to ensure that we're not that any tooling and any data sets and any DBs that we spin up are easily accessible to the rest of the ecosystem, and that we can repeatedly start running experiments in this scientific manner that we're we've been promoting for the longest time. My dream is that we'll get to a point where we'll have a GitHub page, or we'll have a script where somebody can run a few commands, spin up a bunch of Docker instances on their local machines, and then be able to run queries and then publish those in a way that the rest of us can share and confirm some of our suspicions. But that's far easier said than done, though. But it's a discussion that we need to start revisiting, and I think that part of that discussion is figuring out who the stakeholders are, because right now the risk analysts that we have accessible to us are deeply embedded with the risk team right now, and I think that part of that problem is the barrier to entry. We don't have an instruction manual that allows people to spin themselves up and start either confirming or contrasting some of the assumptions that we've been making around these numbers. Did I answer your question, Vishesh, or did I spin off into one of my own pet initiatives?
I am sure that the answer to my question was embedded within your response, but it was definitely broad. And I do want to get a little more specific, actually, which is like we've looked at certain things, like the amount of DAI being drawn out, the amount of collateral, sometimes we looked at the relative collateralization of different CDPs. Sometimes we've looked at things like accrued fees. So I just mean, I haven't, there were a lot of very productive discussions earlier on in the SCD lifecycle where we talked about what kinds of those metrics do we care about, which ones are important, what do they mean. And I think revamping some of those discussions would probably be helpful, especially for people like me that like do the work of trying to surface those answers.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that's a question, maybe a rhetorical question, but like I agree that we need to revisit some of the things, and that's I'm going to keep on harping on this a bit because I don't know, I'm just sort of enamored with this concept. But grandfathering in processes and moving ahead with norms that we've devised based on other other situations that may not exist anymore is a risk, and also losing track of interesting initiatives that we kicked off at the beginning of the year, but put to the wayside because more pressing issues arose. What I like to do at the end of every year, no matter where I'm at or what I'm doing, is take that opportunity to do some soul searching and some re-auditing and surfacing the initial requirements that we had and figuring out what pain points we have with systems that we're currently using. And I think that that's a great point, that not only from a governance perspective, like the process and policies and procedures, that we actually focus on some of the technicals that we started out with that we might have forgotten during the course of the last year. Are you it sounded almost like you were volunteering to head up that initiative. Is that what I just heard, Vishesh? Do you have free time?
Well, I am working on things and having a bit more input from people on the direction of things that I work on.
Is it mainly a question of kind of like the data pipeline and the integrity of the data, and then like having it sync up with other people who are using similar data and stuff like that?
Well, I'll give you a good example. Like when we were producing stats for SCD, like we started to look at different questions like how much of debt is drawn out on new CDPs versus old ones. That was a suggestion that was given by like somebody that was participating in one of these calls where we were having conversations about the types of questions that people are thinking about the nature of how Maker works and like what are still those deeper like mysteries that we don't really understand or the things that we're trying to really manage towards. I think we've like zeroed in the last few months on like a few specific indicators that like we use to make a lot of decisions and or the community uses to make a lot of decisions or maybe the community ignores entirely, makes a lot of decisions anyway. Sometimes unclear how that actually works, but I think we really zeroed in on a couple of metrics, I think, in the last few months. And I'm just opening up the conversation of like, is it worth considering rebroadening that scope as we go into a new iteration of the system that maybe works slightly differently as well.
Okay, I'm on board now. So yeah, I agree completely. And I think that aligns with some of the other bullet points that I listed out at the top of the call. And the one that I keep on coming back to more and more is that we have a wide, well, I shouldn't say wide. We have a few different demographics when it comes to engagement with the system. We have large holders and we have small holders and we have huge holders. We need to continue to internalize and either accept or reject the fact that we're a plutocracy. And I think that we designed a plutocracy. The plutocracy is working the way plutocracy is supposed to work. And I think that, at least personally, I think that's a great thing because it wasn't an accident, right? Like, people with the most skin in the game are incentivized to actively manage their positions. If our incentives are well designed, that active management is good for everybody because that ensures a stable peg. The problem that I'm hearing from these larger stakeholders, and well, all stakeholders, but the larger ones as well, which came as a surprise to me, is that they have the same challenges, understanding what the system is up to, how to properly manage it, which levers affect what has been a problem for them as well. And so if we could come up, if we could do an audit and review with the risk teams that like, here's the numbers that matter, and here's the data that shows that when X happens, Y is the result, and all other things being equal, or when you factor in these external market issues, whatever, we can see that the PEG does this, or the stability fee does this to secondary lending platforms, and sort of distill that down to a dashboard. I think we can get a tremendous amount of value from that by using it as a tool to onboard help educate voters. It's part of that communication thing I was talking about earlier, where we need to come up with mechanisms and tools that allow somebody who's interested in the ecosystem to come in and spend 20 minutes a week doing their research and then feeling comfortable that they've been informed well enough to actually vote on the system. And I think that the key to that is identifying those key metrics that you're talking about.
But some of that don't we expect at some point for that to come as a recommendation from risk teams as to, at some point we're going to have to evolve in the future where we turn more into a binary yes or no, accept the recommendations or not. The amount of information you're talking about being able to consume off of one collateral or maybe two is one thing, but 20, 30, 50, 100, it becomes unmanageable.
I think
that's a great discussion as well. Sorry, let me just say.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, yeah, this is one of my super compelling discussions that we've been having for the last few weeks, is that So we're in this model right now, and this is one of the things I want the ecosystem to examine as we go through this auditing phase, is where we propose or we expose levers, and those levers are a range of numbers, and we ask the community to pick those range of numbers based on their whether they share the same insights. And if significant numbers of people do share those insights, they vote in the same manner, and then we have a path forward. But your point is a very valuable one, Matthew, is that we have risk teams, we have empowered actors in the ecosystem, we have domain experts that we've attracted into the fold. And the question arises, is it their job to actually present a plan that's binary, where we say, yes, that is a good plan. We should, we like that plan. Let's vote on that plan, as opposed to let's vote on a series or an array of numbers that might represent that plan, because then everybody needs to understand the complexities, right? So it depends on what the community's appetite is for entrusting these empowered actors. And I think that if I had to guess, we're probably going to be seeing more and more of that type of thing in the future. Sorry, David, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I agree with Matthew that eventually we do have to like evolve into like this delegatory system where not everybody's going to be doing the integrity checking, but it doesn't take away from our responsibility of providing educational resources and like making it as easy as possible for anybody in the public to learn about how these decisions are being made and where they can actually access that info that we are very keen on making as transparent as we can, obviously with the caveat that some data sets will necessarily be private and yada yada. But I think the whole thing is educating the voter base, because if you don't have an educated voter base, then bad decisions will happen, and an educated voter base will be able to most effectively delegate and then approve the recommendations of those delegated parties. That's just some of my thoughts.
Well, so the point, the broader point, I guess, and this is like a style choice. Do you want to have an operating model where questions are suggested, answers are given, and then strategies are discussed? Or do you want to have an operating model where strategies are recommended, questions are made transparent, and then answers are produced and shared as kind of like a more of a showing your work and less of a conversation?
Well, I think that it's a matter of where we expect the ecosystem to express their voice, right? Because right now we're expecting the voting community to be a part of the risk team, that they follow the discussions, understand the monetary policy, all the variables, and then come up with, figure out whether they also agree with all those data sets, and then put them together in the same order that the risk teams might, and then they vote on each individual number. Perhaps we're engaging the ecosystem too soon. Maybe the voter should be engaged at the end of that process, where here's the business plan, here's the strategy. Do you think this strategy is effective? And if you do, please, or if you're interested, click this link to view all of the reasoning and thoughts and everything that went into it. And here's all the parameters and that make this strategy a yes or no question. That's engaging the ecosystem farther down the line than we have right now. Right now, we're, like I said, we're engaging people at the beginning almost, where here's all the numbers. Do you think that this combination, or it's like a choose your own adventure, kind of like pick all the numbers you like and then see if that makes the thing happen you wanted to have happen. I'm not sure that that's going to be, what we're doing is going to get more and more complicated. So envision a world where we have 10 numbers that need to be assembled in the correct combination every week. I'm not sure that's the case that we can. I'm not sure that that's a reasonable ask. I don't know.
And I think there are aspects to decentralization that we should expect the community to actively participate and vote in, like what collateral, which would impact everybody. That's something I believe that's directly useful for everybody to vote on, is what is a collateral type, the specific type of what are the risk parameters for each collateral and how that changes week, month, quarter. at some point that I shouldn't say that. It makes more logical sense to me that becomes out of the hands of the community and more in the hands of a risk team that had been voted in to make those recommendations that equally could be voted out by the community. And then we subsequently as a community accept or reject those recommendations as an aggregate.
Yeah, that's where everything gets super interesting to me too, because I've been trying to figure out, well, then what does the voting public do in that kind of a model? Because how do we maintain checks and balances? So assuming we had this group of empowered actors that were figuring out some aspect of monetary policy, and it was their job to come back with a plan, and then we said yes or no to that plan, and they were empowered to maybe enact this plan on a weekly basis. How does the community maintain visibility into that process, and how does it retain an opt-out strategy? And I think that potentially is a really interesting area of discussion. So if we had a group that was doing X and it was their job to ensure that X was successful, maybe we could consider a model where on the Monday of the week they present their plan, and then by Thursday the community has an opportunity to disagree with that plan. And if they don't disagree, then that plan goes forward, right? There's all kinds of really interesting ways that we can maintain visibility, but also give people the freedom to do complicated things without expecting a wide range of people. Like right now, we talk about apathy, but that apathy is the friction that we've presented to the ecosystem, right? Like that's a measure of friction, and we're increasing friction. So perhaps empowering a group of actors to do what it is that they're been trained to do, and then just making sure that they continue to do a good job is a smoother way of doing it. That's a big shift, though, in the way that we do things, and so there'd have to be some significant soul searching before that happened. Cyrus, you've been suspiciously quiet about this whole thing.
Yeah, I'm just kind of ingesting information. I mean, I have my thoughts, but I'm still, I don't know, still thinking about it before I share.
Yeah, specific examples, or that would be risky at this stage. But I think that this is something that we can watch it evolve over time. It's entirely up to what the community wants to do. So, and I can't predict how this will develop, because we're still at the very, very, very early stages of this protocol and what it is we're doing here. Like it may be forever in crypto time, but it's nothing in real world time. Like we're a year into this, right? So how we develop and how we respond to increasing complexities, increasing pressures, the emergence of more domain experts coming into our ecosystem, and how we organize them and get them to work together, that's going to be the order of the day for the next 6 months at least. And that's what also loops back to one of the reasons why I really want to start formalizing specific working groups and teams that are very coordinated and specifically asking these types of questions, and iterating with the community and making sure that their findings are being discussed, so we can start asking some of these core questions. Governance is hard. It's capital H hard. It's one of those problems, right? Like, what's one of the things that fascinates me about governance is that it's and crypto in general is that crypto is a very naive but also inspiring effort to reinvent all kinds of wheels in this world. And sometimes we do come up with a better wheel, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we realize that, hey, that wheel was designed that way because that is the only effective way to make a wheel. So this whole process is enormously fascinating, but governance is something that humans have been wrestling with as long as humans have been around. So coming up with ways to do it better is a challenge. Figuring out what that's going to look like is really inspiring. So I encourage anybody with strong opinions to join us in the forum and figure out whether you have the bandwidth to help out with that initiative. Matthew, it sounds like you might be one of the primary engaged stakeholders. How much free time do you have in your life?
0, 3 children.
Yeah, it's the kids thing. It's the kids are really slowing down the development of crypto in general, I've found. We should figure out a solution to that problem. All right, we're actually 2 minutes past the 30 minutes allocated to the Q&A session. So if there's any pressing questions that people have been saving up for the end of the call, now is the time, or I will put an end to this. So let's do some recaps. Migration is a complicated thing. So if you're interested in that, please follow along. Make your opinions heard. There's some interesting threads going on in the forum, trying to gauge some community feedback on how they felt that the migration has been working. We have some important questions that need to be asked in the future about how long migration is going to last and what the community's appetite is for maintaining these two systems. That needs to be addressed. I'm going to be posting that list or that forum thread about how do we create governance version 2. I encourage anybody who has a horse in that race or an aptitude along those lines to please join that discussion and help us flesh that thing out. I think that's the recap, I think. So I want to thanks Report on Governance 1. Yeah, I'll get right on that one. Sure, it'll be the end of day. It's going to be a hard one. Not to be overly flip, but yeah, I think that a part of this, the report on Governance 1 is like the first step on Governance 2, right? Like that's what I was talking about. We have to audit what it is we did and why we did it. And once we understand that, we can figure out what version 2 looks like. So that report is going to be part of this process. Okay, everybody, I think we're going to end it there. Thanks for joining. Let's join the discussions in the forum, and look forward to talking to everybody next week. All right, bye-bye.
Don't close the call yet, Rich. Just stop recording for a second because Xenophon asked an interesting question. Xen, if you just hang around for a second, I can answer it.